I rise to speak of my father, Donald Paul Owen Sr., born July 16, 1940. I am delighted by my civilization's tradition of celebrating a person's life by describing their character and personality and life story and life choices. After someone dies, we say only nice things about them, publicly, so we call it a good speaking, a eulogy. But when someone has lived his life so well that as it winds down there's almost nothing but good to say about them, why wait till they're dead to say it? I have reasons, which should be clear by the end, for writing this while my dad is still very much and very happily alive. In 2008, the day after my dad married Sally Kaplan, I attended her home church in Atlanta, Georgia, and met some of her friends. Several of them asked me to tell them what kind of man my dad was who was taking away their beloved Sally. The first thing I told them is the first thing I would say now. What you've seen of my dad is what he really is. He is genuine. If he has faults, which of course everyone does, they are faults that anyone can see who knows him. No one, and I mean no person ever, could accuse my dad of being two-faced or insincere, much less anything like a double life. With Dad, what you see is what you get. Could I possibly list everything that sets my dad apart as a remarkable person? Let me give a few. As I said, my dad is and always has been sincere. He doesn't do flattery. He doesn't alter or moderate his convictions to fit in. He will, of course, say less than he's thinking, when politeness requires, but he will never say anything he doesn't believe. At the same time, you may hear him defend positions he doesn't hold if they're being misrepresented. This was not because he didn't have his own viewpoint, God knows. And for another thing, all my lifetime we've had a plague of people complaining that their fathers never said, "I love you." None of my dad's children had better say that because Dad told us practically every day. And he still does to those who will listen. We hear many folks also who say, "My dad didn't show emotion and disapproved of showing emotion." What they usually mean, of course, is that their fathers were embarrassed to cry or to be affectionate. All the other emotions are fine. Again, nobody had better say anything like that about Daddy, because we certainly all saw him cry pretty often. He was regularly and openly affectionate to Mom and to us, and to his mom and to his siblings. He was also a deep, warm romantic, but we probably didn't realize that until we were adults. In fact, if any of us learned from Daddy, we learned that showing affection is manly. We learned that expressing grief is masculine and honorable. All of us many times saw Daddy moved to tears by something profound or sad. If anyone discouraged the expression of vulnerable emotions during my childhood, it was the other way around. Whenever Daddy would choke back tears, we would laugh and roll our eyes. And for another thing, if we learned from Dad's example, we learned that self-sacrificing generosity is normal and unremarkable. We learned that hospitality is normal. He didn't need to talk about it or to teach it, and I don't believe he did. If sacrificing himself for someone else ever irritated him, we never saw it. Many's the time I woke up late from my morning paper route and knocked on Dad's door, and every time without the slightest reproach, he drove me around my route without ever asking payment. I'm sure he would rather have spent those hours in bed. And for another thing, my dad has the most extraordinarily balanced view of money and possessions. He always took care of the things he had, but he let them go easily. He owned many things and enjoyed many things, but he held them lightly when they broke or got lost. "Oh, well, they're only things," was a very familiar saying. Man's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. If we learned from Dad, we learned to use things and to love people, rather than the typical human attitude of using people and loving things. It was the same for recreation. It's not unusual to hear people say, "My dad was not afraid of hard work, and he taught us to work hard too." And that was certainly true for us. But my dad had exactly the same attitude about recreation. He enjoyed rest just as much as he enjoyed work, but he never lived for either one. When the recreation, the rest, the Sabbath, the vacation was over, he went to work with the same matter-of-fact attitude that he had rested. No one can ever imagine my dad griping because vacation's over and now it's back to work. How common is that attitude, I'd like to know. And for another thing, my dad was nothing if not faithful, true to his word. I cannot think of a single incident, or even hearing of an incident, where my dad could have been called unreliable. He is without question and without exception a man of his word. By the same token, my dad was also, as far as I've ever seen or heard, 100% honest. No one has ever known him so much as shade the truth. At this point, folks may start to wonder whether my dad could also walk on water. No, of course, he is not superhuman. He has forgotten things and he makes mistakes. He has even sinned occasionally, as I mentioned. But in one respect, everyone who ever knew him could agree that he was practically superhuman. His self-discipline is legendary. My brother once said to him, "Dad, you have a degree of self-control that will perish from the world when you die." And yet, with all his extraordinary gifts of ordinary virtues, he was always surprised to receive a compliment. He is always modest and humble, both when talking about himself and hearing others talk about him. He does not reject praise. He also taught us by example to respond to praise with a simple thank you. But as far as anyone can tell, he was genuinely unaware that he had done anything praiseworthy. I am not going to say that my dad possessed all possible virtues. He does not. He is not impartial, for instance. He is biased in his judgment of other people's character. Also, humor was not his strong point. He didn't say funny things. I believe he knows perhaps 6 jokes, and they're all jokes with a point. You remember especially the geese joke, but also the parenthesis joke and the earthworm joke. His most glaring fault, if you can call it that, which in fact he shares with most of humanity, including myself, might be called broken tile syndrome. My mom, who had the gift for seeing the positive in everything, once said, "I think Owenses have the gift of noticing what's wrong with things." Several of us children have the same gift. We notice first and comment most on what's wrong with anything. As a practical matter, this meant that he was sparing of specific compliments and praise. The ratio of his criticism to his praise generally averaged about 5 to 1, at least in our childhood. And this is no secret. But what's generally less mentioned is that all his praise was sincere. As I said, he doesn't do flattery. So any compliment you get from him is the genuine article. You can take it to the bank. His children have each in their own way come to terms with the results of Dad's shortness of praise. I'm not going to defend it. I have called it a flaw, and he would too. But seriously, people, of all the possible defects that a father could have, is this one really worth focusing on? Think of all the fathers you know personally, whose criticism ratio is not 5 to 1, but literally 100 to 0. Think of all the defects that every other father has. You would really choose them over my dad's flaws? I don't think so. And even in his faults, he was remarkable. As he himself has freely spoken of, he was well into adulthood before he began learning to control anger. But what's less often noticed, because he would never point it out himself, is that Dad never got angry at personal insults or personal inconvenience. Whatever angered him was always someone else being disrespected, usually Mom or God. He was angry, when he was angry, at injustice to others. And he did learn to control it over the years so that the younger ones hardly ever saw it. I can remember fewer than 10 such incidents in the whole time I've known him. They were terrible, but they were not typical. When I was perhaps 3 or 4, I went to work with him one day, and with my little tricycle, I knocked over the 2-story ladder he was standing on. Aside from causing a splatter of white paint on the Cherry Lane Motor Inn parking lot that's probably still there, I broke Dad's wrist. And you know what? I did not get in trouble. I didn't even get the feeling that I'd done anything wrong. And believe me, I would have known. I was pretty often in trouble at that age. Of course, you may say, sure, that's only the right and proper way for a parent to respond to a childish mistake. And that's true, but tell me, how common is it? And for another thing, I mentioned that he took care of his possessions, but he didn't love them. This was true, but it led to some curious results. Not exactly defects, I would say, but very much peculiarities. For instance, if we learned from Dad, we learned to keep our living space clean and tidy. It was never excessive neatness, as it is with many other fathers I've known, but it was there. And yet, for being clean and organized in his own space, my dad was always a mixed bag. The property was always neat and attractive, and so were the vehicles. And they still are. But the shop was a wreck. And it still is. Inside the house, including his own living space and bedroom, were neat and organized. But his desk was always a mess. So much of a mess that he never did desk work at his desk. At every house he's ever lived, he's found somewhere else in the house to regularly do his desk work. And he still does. And for another thing, people have criticized my parents for conflicting over their differences rather than balancing each other. This is false. As an example of how false it is, observe the attitude we learn to have toward other people's approval. It seems to me that Mom and Dad came from opposite sides of that question, but they spent their lives working toward the balance. Dad sometimes seems to revel in popular disapproval, but he has trained himself not to stand out unless it was a matter of righteousness. Mom did value public approval, but she has schooled herself to regard it less and regard God's approval more. Therefore, if we learn from Dad and Mom, we learn to consider popular approval, but not to be led by it. That's just my perception, and others may show that I'm wrong. That's fine, but nobody would dispute that they were united in the healthy, balanced attitude that they modeled towards fashions, trends, and fads. Whenever anything new is introduced, people adopt it in successive waves. Each wave has a name and a characteristic size. This applies to any and all innovations, from technological changes like computers and cell phones to clothing and hairstyle changes. My parents both taught us that Christians should never be the first or the last to adopt a new style or any new thing. We're supposed to stand out from the world by our commitment to God and to righteousness, not by a commitment to previous generations' styles and technologies. Those who follow their example, therefore, tend to be early or late majority adopters for all innovations, unless the innovation is immoral or unbiblical. Immodest clothing or cohabitation were never to be adopted, for instance. And for another thing, I am not almost done. Daddy really is an extraordinary man. Aside from the good qualities that I've already mentioned, which are exceedingly rare throughout the whole human race, he had just as many good qualities which are more common, but deserve to be mentioned all the same. I promise you never saw him act in an unfriendly way toward anyone. You never saw him shirk work. No one could ever call him lazy. No one has ever heard Daddy boast or brag. The self-criticism that sometimes afflicted him when he was discouraged and which embarrassed his children was never twinged with self-pity. He lamented sometimes excessively that he was inadequate, that he was a failure, but he never lamented that awful things happened to him that he didn't deserve. Never. I dare anyone to relate a single incident of passive aggression. I don't mean rarely, I mean literally never. He was not capable of such a thing. And that's just to speak of his general character and behavior. He was a man of a few trivial and commonplace faults and many ordinary and extraordinary virtues. Like everyone, my dad has had many roles. Since those virtues are part of his soul, I can confidently assure you that he showed them in every role he ever fulfilled. I knew him best in his role as a father, and as his children, we saw his character and behavior on display and as life models to a degree that perhaps no one else did, who was not married to him. And if we were open to hearing, we learned many things from him, both ordinary and extraordinary. Certainly we learned what many children with good parents have learned. We learned from him to be kind to each other. We learned to forgive when we were sinned against and to leave vengeance to God. We learned to save money and to pay our debts. We learned not to take candy from strangers. We learned to be polite and respectful, to excuse ourselves as we left the table or left the room. We learned to be punctual and to keep our word, even if it hurt. We learned that it often takes years to get a good reputation, but only a few seconds to lose it. We learned not to be disruptive, unless something was going on hateful to God. Then we ought to be disruptive. Does anybody remember him with Ron Skiratus? Actually, I guess that last is not such a common lesson, is it? How many people got to witness a living example of politeness and when not to be polite? But that's just a start. With Dad as my father, I learned many things that I could scarcely have learned anywhere else. Hardly any other parents on the planet could have so thoroughly conveyed to us the value of suffering. Not that suffering is good, of course. If it was good, we would enjoy it and it wouldn't be suffering. But that it will always, without exception, bring good when we respond well. While he worked hard to protect us from needless suffering, he taught us by model and instruction to expect pain in this life, to not think it strange when some fiery trials come upon us, as if some strange thing were happening to us. Pain and suffering is not a positive good itself, otherwise heaven would be pointless. But it always brings good when we submit to it without complaint and walk through it. Pain is how God removes the rotten, misshapen, ugly, and stinking parts of our character. If I accept it from God's hand, my life will always be better for it in the long run. This I learned from him and Mom. And it has proved to be so. For another thing, hardly anyone I know seems to have learned the danger of comparing myself to other people. Compare myself to someone who's doing worse than I am, and I'll think I'm better than I really am. Compare myself to someone better than I am, and I may not be aware that that person is backsliding, and I'll imitate them to my own destruction. Compare myself to someone with different giftings, which is of course everybody, is to invite arrogance or despair. Comparing myself to anyone else can be an idle curiosity, but if I make decisions on it, I am likely to go pretty far wrong. This also I learned from them, and it has proved to be so. For another thing, few people I know, even those of the highest character, seem to have learned what Dad taught us and modeled to us about the foolish habit of taking up someone else's offense. What? He did that to you? Well, I used to think highly of him, but wow, see if I ever give him a friendly word. Times without number I've had friends of mine turn against some third person because of what that third person did to me, or turn against me because someone else complained to them about me. No. If someone else is hurt or offended by a third person, but that third person has not hurt or offended me, my relationship with that third person is unchanged. This, we learn from him, is a recipe for peaceful relationships. And it has proved to be so. And for another thing, how do you respond to criticism? A wise person is guided from outside, not by his own inner impulses. If you are a wise person, as Henry Cloud put it many years later, when the light comes to you, you will adjust yourself to match the light. When the truth comes, the wise person changes. Listen to input and criticism, no matter who it comes from. God spoke to Balaam through a donkey. He who will not learn by hearing must learn by hurting. So be wise and learn by hearing. This, we learn from Dad and Mom, is the path to maturity and to favor with God and man. And it has proved to be so. And for another thing, Daddy once read to us a book called Sheriff at Waterstop, which had the line, "As they began to come to their senses apart from the mob." He stopped at that point and explained the mob mentality to us. Ordinary, decent people can do extraordinarily evil things when they're part of a mob. We must always be detached from every crowd we're in, observing and deciding for ourselves what to do next. If we had followed Dad's example and instruction, we would have learned to stand alone, to think and choose for ourselves. Sadly for us, Daddy did not successfully teach us how to live above the pressure of the crowd and to ignore the pressure to fit in. He didn't give us details. Why? I can only speculate. Dad cared very little, if at all, if other people disapproved. He appeared to have been naturally immune from people-pleasing and from groupthink. Many of us admired this, saw its value, and tried to imitate it. We knew it was desirable. But I don't believe any of us actually did learn from Daddy's example on that. For all of us to some degree, and for myself to a painful degree, other people's opinion has been an excessive concern, a millstone and a trap. We learned by hurting that giving in to peer pressure is the path to many foolish and destructive choices, just as he taught us it would be. Those of us who gradually shed this burden, over decades and in agony, have found what he said we would find. Internal peace, quiet confidence, and healthy choices are possible when I can think and act apart from the mob. And so it has proved. And for another thing, from Dad's example, we learned to be modest and not self-promoting. Let someone else find out what you did. Let another man praise you and not your own lips. Don't toot your own horn. At least in my line of work, this is irritatingly rare. People whose character is otherwise exemplary seem never to have heard that self-promotion is vulgar and unseemly. You should see the tune I wrote. Are you going to include my hymn? Let me tell you about the songbook I made. When I led singing, I did great. And on and on and on. I don't remember if Mom or Dad actually instructed us against bragging or boasting, though I expect they did, but I know this. You would never hear Dad or Mom do it. If I learned from their example, I learned to willingly offer to others what I've done, or what I'm able to do, and then forget about it. What I do remember being instructed about is how to act if I think I fell short. If I'd been paying attention, I would have known this from their example. If my batch of bread failed, I would have apologized to the family one time and let it go. Anything more is fishing for pity. Self-promotion and self-criticism, both are vulgar. At the same time, however, that he encouraged us not to brag, he encouraged us to tell him about our successes and the compliments we got. It's not bragging to tell your dad, he said. And what else? If we had learned from their example, we would have learned that we are not superior to other people. Feeling superior is obnoxious and dangerous, and it's not true. What do I have that I have not received? A person can have nothing that was not given to him from above. He must increase, I must decrease. We're very familiar quotes. We all saw Dad live this way, but I bet we can hardly remember him saying so. It was something he did, hardly something that he taught. And sadly, this is a lesson most of us failed to learn to various degrees. I know I failed spectacularly. Why? I can only speculate. Since Dad and Mom evidently were never tempted to think more highly of themselves than they ought, they were not on guard to that danger in their children. And what else? We learned from them to think by analogy, but not to make the analogy walk on all fours. Daddy is a wealth of instant analogies on any subject, and we learned how to grasp only the relevant part of the analogy. I've since found this is not a common skill. I can't tell you how frustrating, how baffling and deflating it is to talk to someone who doesn't understand analogies, who consistently take the wrong comparison or thinks I'm changing the subject. It makes communication next to impossible, except on the most primitive level. And what else? We learned from Dad to respect our emotions, but not to live by them. To circumspectly express our feelings, but not to make decisions based on them. And what else? Well, time would fail me to tell of the skills and character which Daddy taught, which it seems nobody else's dad ever taught them. And for the most part, we learned these things without realizing it. Only as adults did most of us realize how rare they are, how very few other parents ever taught such things. And furthermore, our parents taught us all this without neglecting a host of more common life skills. From our parents, we learned friendly politeness. We learned to work hard. We learned promptness, honesty, a healthy diet, regular sleep. We learned to dress clean and neat. We learned to write neatly and legibly. We learned to speak clean and clearly. We learned to be kind to animals and small children, etc., etc., etc. So, as I say, they told us to value and practice these things, and they meted out consequences when we fell short. Fairly minor consequences, it seems to be now, compared to the disasters we would experience if we fell short in adult life. But what's not so often mentioned is they also modeled all these habits. They showed us how. Can anyone imagine my dad or mom saying, "Do as I say, not as I do"? Not hardly. One more thing we learned from Dad, or could have if we were paying attention, perhaps the most important. Daddy showed us how deep someone's love for God can go. From Dad, we can see that it's possible to love God and to love other people all the way down. When God showed Daddy a severe mercy, Dad's reflex, consistently and sincerely, was to bow to God and in his grief declare his trust. That is my dad's hallmark. If I genuinely accept that life is not about me, if I work to meet my own needs because I love God and I love other people, then I will not be inclined to stop loving God, to stop putting him and other people first, when I feel my own needs are not being met. I will not become selfish when I'm unhappy. I'm not just using altruism and submission as a cover-up for serving myself. But if I am loving God and others because I secretly want rewards for myself, then after enough time of not getting rewards, I will probably turn against God. Daddy has never been seriously tempted to question God or God's goodness. I know this from his own mouth and from his whole life. He would attribute this faithfulness to God's work in him, of course, but for us that wasn't the point. The point is, we saw and can still see that it's possible to love and trust a God who is always good, but not always nice. I know it's possible. Just look at Dad. Shall I go on? I don't feel that this is enough praise, but I recognize that some of my listeners will feel that it's a good deal too much. Not all his children remember their childhood the way I remember mine. In fact, it's quite astonishing how differently my siblings remember our childhood. An outsider would be excused for thinking we had different parents. Obviously, I would not gainsay or even comment on anyone else's memories or emotional impression of those years in our home. But for my own part, I'm glad to state publicly that I had an almost supremely happy childhood. My memories begin quite early, around 18 months, and I have thousands from that time until my mom died as I was turning 20. Despite my Owen's habit of noticing the bad before the good, I struggle to produce any specific memories that were not peace, joy, and love, particularly from my parents, but also from their friends and from my siblings. The only real stains on this memory are the times I did wrong and had a bad conscience and needed consequences. But when I got the consequences, the skies were bright and clear again. And so the only lasting unpleasantness that I can recall from those 20 years are the times that my wrong got overlooked, or when I successfully hid it and never got consequences. I can scarcely blame anyone for that except myself. And as an adult, I have been freed from the lingering guilt that I felt for not having consequences. The other parts of my childhood that I regret are my constant bickering with my older brother and my constant put-downs of my younger brother. And here again, this is hardly my parents' responsibility. So let's consider my dad's life as a whole. In his later years, his personality and character are pretty much settled, and the impact he will have on the world has essentially been launched. His heritage is a known quantity, right? And now what's happened? Why, suddenly 2 of his child training techniques have gone out of style. And that, along with one of his genuine character flaws, are being used to dismiss and to diss everything he stands for, everything he has lived for and done, and everyone else who wants to live for the same goals. His first out-of-style child training method is making rules of behavior by appealing to an ultimate standard. Well, of course, anyone who would rather not appeal to an ultimate standard will soon find that they can't make any rules. They can only try to enforce their own preferences. After all, if I discard the rule of law, whether in my personal life or my family or the community, I will soon face the only alternatives, the horror of chaos or the terror of tyranny, and often both in quick succession. His other out-of-style parenting technique is, of course, corporal discipline. Never mind that every spanking from mom and dad ended with a hug and reestablished harmony, and usually with a song. Well, the song was mostly for mom. Never mind that both of them almost never disciplined in anger, and they asked our forgiveness when they did. Never mind that, as I mentioned, we were never disciplined because they were personally inconvenienced. Forget all that. In the last few decades, the crowd has simply decided that the way all parents everywhere have trained the next generation should now be considered abuse. Those 2 currently unpopular convictions, combined with his unpleasant personality trait of noticing the unpleasant, are taken out of proportion, completely ignoring the overwhelmingly good and beneficial work he did, the countless profound benefits accrued to everyone blessed enough to have been raised by Don and Fran Owens. Those three things, I say, are now being used to slander Daddy, and by extension, everything he believes, and everything he has done, and anyone else who believes the same. The idea of a biblical lifestyle, and one man's attempt to discover and live a biblical lifestyle, I will not comment on or try to defend. What would be the point? Anyone who rejects the Bible will obviously reject any attempt at a biblical lifestyle. So that is not an interesting topic. But I will stand up and publicly defend my father when he is being defamed. I am delighted to say, to whomever in all the world that will listen, I don't merely claim that my parents were not that bad. I don't claim that the slander is exaggerated. It is absurdly, outrageously false. We had an extraordinary childhood. Our parents were 1 in a million. Anyone who says otherwise is saying more about themselves than they're saying about Dad or his parenting. No multitude of words will undo our parents' lifetime of loving and faithful actions. In the same way, this multitude of words will not express sufficient gratitude for it. But it's a start. Thank you, Daddy, and thank you, God, for my dad.